It is 0313 hours, local time, and something almost unimaginable is happening in the capital of Crimea. At Ovrazhki, about 25 miles east of the city of Simferopol, a storage site for Iskander tactical ballistic missile systems, despite being very carefully concealed, is being swallowed by a sea of fire. This is a hardened, underground, reinforced concrete bunker complex at a missile base dating back to the old Soviet era. That helps the facility blend into the terrain and into infrastructure that has long existed on the map. The Iskander systems are stored inside thick concrete shelters, allowing them to avoid direct observation from Ukraine's conventional optical satellites. But the biggest question is not just what is happening there. The real question facing the Russian authorities is this: how did these Ukrainian FP-2 drones manage to find this secret missile storage site and then strike it with such precision? And even more astonishing, why was their most modern air defense system in the world unable to detect even a single drone before they reached the Crimean Peninsula? At the foot of the Crimean Mountains, a Russian Panzer S-1 system was swinging its radar in panic. The base below may have been a legacy of the Soviet era, but the system protecting it was anything but old. The Panzer S-1 is a modern point defense weapon designed to intercept UAVs, cruise missiles, and protect strategic targets in the final seconds. It had just burned through $8 million worth of missiles and still failed to shoot down a single drone cheaper than an old Ford. The Iskander storage site below had been camouflaged almost perfectly. Russia had placed it inside a cluster of old Soviet-era reinforced concrete bunkers, pressed deep into the hillside and blended into abandoned storage yards, old internal roads, technical vehicle lots, and support structures that had existed on the map for decades. Seen from an optical satellite, the area looked no different from a deteriorating infrastructure cluster. The bunker entrances were covered with earth, rocks, bushes, and infrared-suppressing camouflage nets. These materials did not just hide the shape of the structures, but also blurred the heat coming from the Iskander launchers, generators, and maintenance equipment inside. Around the real site, Russia placed multiple decoys, launcher mock-ups, false heat sources, fake tire tracks, and deception positions meant to pull Ukrainian reconnaissance away from the main bunker. The operating crews also maintained strict radio discipline, limited bright lights at night, and moved only during short time windows to avoid detection by reconnaissance UAVs. But it was precisely the excessive silence, the repeating heat signatures, the vehicle routes that appeared and disappeared at the same point, and the way the decoys were arranged too cleanly that turned the site into a suspicious point. When the FP-2 UAVs came in at an altitude of about 150 feet, the Panzer launched its first salvo of 57 E-6 missiles. In theory, each one could intercept a low-flying target at a range of 12 miles. But after losing 4 missiles, not a single FP-2 had been shot down. Now the combat crew switched to the final option: anti-aircraft guns. The twin 30mm 2A38M cannons opened fire at a rate of 5,000 rounds per minute, tearing through the darkness with continuous bright red tracer lines. In a few seconds, the mountainside in front of the base lit up like a net of fire. The sight was dramatic, but almost useless. The burst swept across the hillside, passing behind or below the FP-2 formation. The problem was not only aim. The UAVs were flying across the beam of the 1RS-11E radar, creating a Doppler notch. To the radar, they were almost neither closing in nor moving away, causing radial velocity to drop close to zero. On the processing screen, they began to resemble background clutter from the ground and were partially filtered out by the system. The terrain of Crimea made the error worse. Radar waves bounced off rocky slopes, concrete roofs, and old structures, creating false reflection shadows around each drone. The 1RS-21E fire control radar tried to hold lock, but the tracking computer had to keep distinguishing between the real target and ghost images. The aim point was pulled only a few yards away from the FP-2, but for a small, low-flying target, a few yards were enough to miss. The missiles did no better. The proximity fuse needed a reflection strong enough to trigger at the right moment, but the FP-2 was too small, with a radar cross-section far lower than standard targets such as helicopters, large cruise missiles, or heavy UAVs. The 57 E-6 missiles passed close to the target, but not close enough to detonate at the correct time. Inside the control cabin, the signal appeared and disappeared. The radar had the target, then lost it. The thermal camera saw a small bright trace. Then it was swallowed by the background of earth, rock faces, and old concrete structures. The Panzer kept firing, but the FP2 swarm did not slow down. Everything had failed against a low flight path, a lateral approach angle, a radar return too small to hold cleanly, and a few deadly seconds of confusion. While the Panzer S1 operator was still trying to understand why his system had suddenly turned into an expensive block of metal, more FP2 UAVs appeared on the thermal screen. They were not coming in along a straight line. They were converging from different directions, hugging the terrain like a swarm of mechanical hornets closing in around the Iskander depot. The Panzer's radar detected them at about 1.2 miles. But at that range, everything was already too late. The 57 E6 missile needed 1 mile to stabilize its flight path, activate its combat cycle, and bring its fuse into a ready state at a closing speed of 90 miles per hour. That left only about 15 seconds from the first detection to the moment the targets flashed past the interception zone. 15 seconds to identify. 15 seconds to lock on. 15 seconds to fire at objects. The system was almost not designed to see clearly. Radio traffic immediately erupted across Russian frequencies. The air defense coordinator shouted for fighter cover. The Panzer crew reported multiple contacts closing in, but said they could not engage effectively. Another voice yelled that the missiles would not hold lock. These were not Tomahawks. These were not fighter aircraft. These were small FP2 UAVs flying low, as fast as cars on a highway, and it was precisely that small size that was making them almost disappear into the background clutter of Crimea's terrain. At 03:17 hours local time, the elite FP2 made a slight course correction, aligning directly with the first bunker inside the camouflaged Iskander storage area. From the outside, it looked only like an old earthen mound blended into the hillside, with weathered concrete, bushes, and infrared suppressing camouflage nets. But inside was missile storage site? No. Worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the place where Iskander tactical ballistic missile systems were stored to supply the missile frigates at the port of Sevastopol. It was protected behind multiple layers of reinforced concrete and hardened bunker doors. This structure had been designed to survive satellite reconnaissance, conventional artillery strikes, and attacks from above. But no one had calculated a different scenario. An FP2 UAV flying low along the mountainside, slipping through radar gaps, approaching at an altitude of only 120 feet, and then driving straight into the bunker entrance from an angle the defensive system could not process in time. Behind the lead drone, the remaining FP2s split off one by one toward their assigned targets: bunker entrances, auxiliary technical areas, field power sources, and locations suspected of sheltering launcher vehicles. The Panzer operator could only stare at the thermal screen, where each small bright trace crossed the final interception zone one after another. The failure report was transmitted to headquarters almost immediately. The order came back in desperation: scramble fighters, now. Just as the Panzer S1 was nearly losing its ability to stop the attack, a Russian Su-35S came diving through the pre-dawn darkness. This was Russia's heavyweight counterpart to the F-16, equipped with the N-35 Ovrazhki radar, the OLS-35 infrared sensor, thrust vectoring engines, and up to 12 weapon hardpoints. If the Panzer was the last defensive layer on the ground, then the Su-35S was the desperate attempt to retake the low-altitude sky. But the Ovrazhki radar immediately ran into problems. The FP2 UAVs were flying low at only about 200 feet, blending into rocky slopes, old concrete structures, and ground that still retained heat. On the screen, they did not appear as clear targets. They showed up for 2 or 3 sweeps, then dropped back below the clutter threshold before the system could build a stable track file. The pilot switched to the OLS-35, but the infrared sensor did no better. The Su-35S was designed to hunt blazing hot jet engines. The FP2, by contrast, left only a faint heat trace from its electric motor, battery, and composite body. Flying low against the terrain, they looked like weak thermal streaks, there one moment and gone the next. Even so, the Su-35S pilot decided to fire. The first R-73 plunged down and caught an FP-2 flying steadily. A few seconds later, the warhead detonated 12 feet from the target. The first UAV disappeared from the thermal screen. The second missile was launched almost immediately, locking onto an FP-2 that had just climbed about 40 feet to clear a tree line. A flash burst out. The second drone was torn out of formation. In that moment, the Russians thought they had found the way to end the attack, but the Ukrainians understood the same thing. If they kept flying steadily, the entire FP-2 formation would be destroyed one by one. Immediately, the remaining UAVs switched to irregular zigzag trajectories. At one moment, they shifted left by 6 to 10 feet. At the next, they jerked right. Then they dropped low against the terrain. Then they climbed 20 to 30 feet and immediately dipped again. Every 1 to 2 seconds, they created a new flight path, a new relative speed, a new problem for the radar and fire control computer. The pilot fired the third missile. It drove down at more than Mach 2, but the FP-2 changed direction just before the seeker could stabilize its lock. The R-73 shot past behind it and exploded uselessly beyond the mountainside. The fourth missile was fired in desperation. This time it closed so tightly that the camera on one FP-2 shook violently from the shockwave, but it still did not hit. At a distance of only about 1.2 miles, a small, low target that kept changing direction did not give the missile enough space to correct its flight path. In less than 60 seconds, the Su-35S had fired 4 missiles. 2 UAVs were shot down. The other 2 became useless explosions in the dark. The pilot began to hesitate. $3 million air-to-air missiles were being used to hunt FP-2 UAVs that were smaller, cheaper, and far harder to see. He made a major decision he would probably regret later: switch to cannon fire. The 30mm GS-301 cannon under the Su-35S opened fire at a rate of 1,500 rounds per minute. In one short 3-second burst, more than 70 rounds ripped into the darkness, forming bright red streaks sweeping across the FP-2 formation. But the cannon did not solve the problem either. The fire control computer had to predict the intercept point based on the target's current flight path. Against an aircraft or helicopter, that could work, but the FP-2 did not hold its direction long enough. By the time the computer finished calculating the firing angle, the drone had already drifted left, dipped down, or jerked right by a few feet. By the time the burst had traveled nearly 3,000 feet, that small error had turned into a miss of whole dozens of yards. The burst kept cutting across the mountainside. There was no direct explosion, no debris, no additional FP-2 disappeared. While the Su-35S was still trying to correct its angle of attack, the lead FP-2 had already slipped out of the danger zone. It dropped even lower, hugged the folds of the terrain, and drove straight toward Bunker No. 2 of the Iskander storage site. This area was a critical logistics link in the Iskander network in Crimea, capable of supplying munitions, launcher vehicles, and technical equipment to launch positions at Cape Chata on the eastern side of the peninsula. From there, the Iskander-M, with a range of about 300 miles, could threaten Mykolaiv, Kherson, command posts, ammunition depots, and supply routes deep behind the Ukrainian front line. So, if Bunker No. 2 were destroyed, the loss would not be just a concrete bunker door. It could disrupt the entire supply chain for subsequent missile launches. In the final moment, the FP-2 made a slight adjustment to its nose. The bunker entrance appeared on the camera as a dark patch beneath earth, bushes, and camouflage netting. From the outside, it still looked like part of the hillside, but inside were missiles, propellant, maintenance equipment, and combat components that Russia had tried to hide from satellites. At 03:22 hours local time, the FP-2 slammed into Bunker No. 2. A flash burst out at the foot of the mountain. The first explosion tore apart the camouflage layer and blew open part of the reinforced bunker door. A few seconds later, fire shot out from inside, followed by secondary explosions as flammable materials, auxiliary fuel, and missile components began to ignite. A structure once designed to hide from reconnaissance had now turned into a giant bright point on every sensor in the area. Above, the Su-35S pulled up hard. 4 missiles had left the rails. Cannon ammunition had been heavily reduced. Fuel had reached the warning threshold after multiple low-altitude passes and violent maneuvers. The pilot reported back to headquarters. 2 UAVs shot down, but the entire formation could not be stopped. A withdrawal request was sent. A few seconds later, it was approved. And below the Crimean Mountains, the Iskander depot began burning fiercely, and more importantly, multiple drones were still advancing toward this secret missile storage site. But the radar signal report sent back by the pilot showed something impossible. These new contacts were not coming from Ukrainian territory. They were appearing out of nowhere, materializing 6 miles from the coastline like ghosts rising from the sea itself. The ground command center received the same unthinkable result. While the Russians were focused on what was already in the air, they did not notice what was right under their noses only 6 miles off the Crimean coast. Ukraine could not control FP2S directly from Odessa to Crimea through a single radio signal. At a distance of hundreds of miles, the curvature of the Earth, electronic interference, and coastal terrain would cut the connection after only a short stretch. So, they used an intermediate layer. Sea Baby unmanned boats developed by the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU. These were not ordinary military boats. They were small, hard-to-detect unmanned platforms that could approach the waters off Crimea before launching or supporting FP2 UAVs. Some Sea Baby craft operated as carrier platforms, while others served as floating relay stations. At a distance of about 6 to 12 miles off the Crimean coast, they became mobile communication towers on the sea surface. From Odessa, the control commands did not go directly to the UAVs. They were transmitted through an encrypted data link to the Sea Baby. From there, the relay craft retransmitted the signal to the FP2S flying near the coast. The video feed from the UAVs traveled in the opposite direction, from the FP2S back to the Sea Baby, and then relayed to the control center almost in real time. This arrangement allowed Ukraine to avoid maintaining a radio link more than 120 miles long across the Black Sea. With only 3 to 5 Sea Baby craft arranged in a chain offshore, it was enough to create a temporary data corridor for the most dangerous part of the mission. When the FP2S were flying low, hugging the terrain, and entering the protected zone. For Russia, this was a very difficult problem. The Nebo-M early warning radar can detect large targets at distances of hundreds of miles, especially aircraft, ballistic missiles, or high-flying targets. But the Sea Baby sits only very low above the water, causing its radar cross-section to be blended into wave clutter. It sounded impressive until you looked at the geometry. If an early warning radar is positioned at an altitude of about 3,000 feet and can only depress its scan beam down to about -4 degrees, it will not see everything right on the sea surface directly beneath it. Within about 6 miles of the coast, there will exist a low zone that the radar cannot scan deeply enough to reach. The Sea Baby rises only 15 feet above the waves. It does not need stealth, it only needs to move into the zone the radar cannot see. That is not luck, that is trigonometry. And when the first FP2 UAV struck the door of the Iskander missile storage bunker, the Sea Baby craft offshore immediately switched to their next role. Small launch bays opened, more FP2S left their racks in the darkness, their electric motors whining like a swarm of angry hornets, then drove low toward the Crimean Mountains. After crossing the Crimean coast, the FP2S immediately dropped below 200 feet, pressing tightly along the folds of the Crimean Mountains. At that altitude, they almost disappeared from the clean radar picture the Russians expected to see. Their signals were broken up by rocky slopes, old concrete blocks, ground still holding heat, and overlapping pockets of terrain clutter. From that point on, the mission was no longer a sea-crossing flight. It became a low-altitude penetration through complex terrain. The Sea Baby created the data link offshore, and the FP2S exploited the terrain shadow inland. So when the FP2S began appearing around the Iskander depot, they were not UAVs that had flown blind for hundreds of miles. They were still receiving commands, still transmitting images, and still being adjusted in the terminal phase thanks to the offshore relay layer. The Ukrainian operators could be far from the front line, but they could still see the bunker door, the entrances, the camouflage layer, and suspicious points on their screens. What confused Russia was that even if they detected a control signal, the nearest source might not be on Ukrainian territory at all, but on a small Sea Baby offshore. And by the time they could localize it, The FP-2S had already left the sea surface, crossed the Crimean coast, and slipped into the terrain shadow of the Crimean Mountains. By then, the distance between the lead UAV and the Iskander bunker door was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in only a few thousand feet. At 03:26 hours, local time, as the eastern horizon began to pale, more Sea Baby craft appeared offshore of Crimea. They did not rush toward the coast. They slowed down, held position, and then opened small launch bays on their decks. Groups of FP-2 UAVs lifted off from their racks in the darkness. They did not fly in any easily recognizable military formation. No single file, no spearhead, no obvious attack cluster. They spread out like seagulls foraging at dawn, each one moving in a different direction, but all converging on the same point: the central bunker holding Iskander missiles in the Crimean Mountains. The coastal radars should have seen the Sea Baby craft, but Russia's signal filters were programmed to ignore too many things that were small, slow, and low on the water. Fishing boats, buoys, civilian craft, wave clutter. The Sea Baby only had to move below about 17 miles per hour to blend into that background. To the coastal surveillance computers, they did not look like an attack, they looked like civilian traffic. Within 2 minutes, the lead FP-2 of the second wave had crossed the coast, dropped below 200 feet, and hugged the mountainside. Its target was not an exposed structure, but the central Iskander bunker, the place that could hold missile munitions, reload vehicles, maintenance equipment, and spare combat modules. From the outside, the bunker almost disappeared into the terrain. Earth and rock covered the roof. Bushes masked the entrance. Infrared suppressing camouflage nets blurred the heat signature. But every underground structure has weak points: bunker doors, ventilation shafts, cable runs, maintenance accesses, and technical vehicle routes. Those were the points the FP-2S were guided toward. These doors were designed to withstand 500 pounds per square inches of overpressure from bombs exploding above them, impressive engineering against indirect strikes. But no one had planned for a small UAV diving straight into the edge of the door with a shaped charge at contact range. When the warhead struck the surface, the molten copper jet could create pressure of up to 2 million psi at the point of impact. Under that pressure, even reinforced steel was almost like paper. At 03:28 hours local time, the first drone slammed into the southern technical access door. The explosion tore apart the camouflage layer and blew off the outer cover plates. A few seconds later, the second struck the eastern ventilation cluster, where the pipes and electrical cables passed through the concrete. The effect began spreading inward. Smoke was drawn backward through the ventilation system. Temperature rose. Auxiliary power fluctuated. The very systems that had kept the bunker functioning, ventilation, electricity, cable runs, were now becoming channels for fire and pressure. By 03:29 hours local time, 3 more FP-2S were coming in from different angles. One struck the internal road leading down to the bunker entrance. One drove into the cluster of technical vehicles near the secondary access. The last targeted the field generator area. None of those hits needed to destroy the entire facility. They only had to cut power, block exits, set the ventilation system on fire, and throw the bunker interior out of control. About 2 miles away, an Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate received the late warning. Its 100mm A-190 naval gun immediately traversed toward the target. This is a high-rate, automatic gun capable of firing dozens of rounds per minute. But the targets in front of it were too small, too low, and too close to the coast. The A-190 opened fire. The 100mm shells ripped through the darkness, exploding on the sea surface and the coastal slope. The flashes reflected off the water. But the FP-2S did not fly steadily long enough for the computer to calculate the correct intercept point. The salvo built a dramatic wall of fire, but too sparse to stop small targets that were constantly changing direction. On the mountain, the main attack wave had entered its final phase. The central Iskander bunker was no longer a dark point on satellite imagery. It had become a heat source. The camouflage layer was burning away in patches. The secondary door had been torn open. The access road was blocked by debris and damaged technical vehicles. By 03:31 hours local time, one FP-2 drove straight into the main bunker door. This explosion penetrated deeper. The pressure wave rolled down the tunnel, drove fire through the concrete corridor, and struck the missile material storage area near the entrance. A few seconds later, the first secondary explosion appeared. Not a single flash, but a short sequence of repeated tremors as if each compartment inside was being awakened one by one. Fire burst out of the bunker entrance, was sucked back inside, then flared even harder. On the thermal screen, the entire entrance shifted from gray to white. That was the moment the Russians understood they were no longer protecting a secret target. They were watching it being destroyed layer by layer. On the map, the defensive network around Crimea still looked dense. Early warning radars, S-400S, Pantsir frigates, and coastal observation posts. But to stop an attack like this, they needed early warning, accurate classification, stable target data, and enough reaction time. All of it came too late. The Sea Baby craft had brought the FP-2S close to shore. The terrain had hidden them from radar, and by the time the Russian system finally understood what was happening, the UAVs were already at the bunker door. A few seconds were all the FP-2S needed. The final strike fell on the central area storing the Iskander missiles. The FP-2 UAV flew low through the smoke pouring out from the secondary doors, made a slight adjustment to its nose, and then slammed straight into the reinforced door section of the main bunker. This was the most critical area of the entire facility, the place where missile components, reload equipment, and technical material were kept near the coordination line inside the base. The shaped charge detonated on contact. A white flash burst out. The main bunker door, which had been designed thicker and safer to withstand pressure from external explosions, was penetrated at its weakest seam. The molten penetrator cut through steel, concrete, and the protective compartment behind it, opening the way for fire and pressure to surge deep into the structure. For the first few seconds, the explosion looked only like a localized hit. Then the entire underground complex began to react. Black smoke burst from the door seams. Fire rolled through the technical corridors. Small secondary explosions appeared in sequence, showing that the heat had reached power cables, flammable materials, ventilation lines, and more sensitive storage compartments deeper inside. The fire quickly spread to the missile coordination cluster within the same system, knocking out auxiliary power, severing internal communications, and forcing the entire facility into emergency status. The damage no longer lay in a single door being breached. Once the central area caught fire, Russia could not simply put out the flames and continue operating. They had to seal off the area, check the safety of the ammunition, assess the structure, inspect every cable line, and verify the coordination center again before any Iskander missile could be brought out to the launch positions. That created an operational gap. If the facility was supplying Iskander missiles for Russia's entire battlefield, then every hour of disruption meant fewer ready missiles, fewer reload vehicles in operation, and longer preparation times for subsequent launch waves. Russia might still have other launchers, but the rotation tempo of long-range firepower in this area had been slowed down. That was the real objective of the strike, not just to destroy a bunker, but to hit the exact bottleneck that would throw the entire Iskander logistics chain out of rhythm. In your view, what was the single most decisive factor in this attack? The Sea Baby bringing the FP-2S close to shore, the low-altitude flight path through the Crimean Mountains, or Ukraine choosing the exact weak point of the Iskander bunker? Leave your comment below.